Oliver, they actually showed you around the essential architecture, the building blocks of this machine, and man, that's a big heatsink and cooling assembly there.
It is a really big heatsink and cooling assembly. I'll touch on that in a moment. It's quite a unique thermal design, as I'm sure you'll see. But basically, in terms of that broad spec, starting with storage, it ships with a 2230 SSD of either a 512 gigabyte or 2 terabyte capacity. It's an M.2 SSD. It can fit a 2280 SSD, though there is space for that, and it's easily upgradable. And then there's also an SD slot. It's not an SD Express, so it's standard micro SD XC. I asked about this, and in their experience, they said it works pretty well, but obviously that's going to have a pretty large speed penalty relative to the internal storage. So I'd imagine, based off of Steam Deck testing, you'd probably want to install demanding games to the SSD. But if you do have a Steam Deck, this is a cool feature they highlighted several times to me. If you do have a Steam Deck, or indeed a Steam frame, which we'll talk about in a separate video, you can take your micro SD card, unplug it from that device, plug it into another device, and get those games running on it, right? So it's a very easy hot swap kind of system there if you do have multiple games on an SD card. So in terms of the actual like meaty part of the specification, this is the interesting part. So the CPU is a 6-core AMD Zen 4 design at up to 4.8 gigahertz, they're quoting here. It only consumes about 30 watts, according to their spec sheet and according to a Valve employee I talked to. And other leaks have suggested it's based on a Hawk Point, potentially. That is a mobile APU that's similar to the AMD Z1 products. Those were based on the Phoenix silicon. This is like a slight evolution or refresh of that silicon. Potentially. Again, potentially, they didn't confirm that to me. I'm not too worried about this part of the spec, given that we're targeting TVs, generally 60 FPS, that kind of thing. I think it should be capable of that in most titles. I don't think you're going to have huge issues with that part. I think it's probably going to be okay, at least relative to the other parts of the spec, which may pose more problems. It has 16 gigabytes of DDR5. That is in a SO-DIMM configuration, so basically laptop parts here. And that is user replaceable, but you have to take apart the unit some ways to get there. So not as easy as the SSD. On the GPU side of things, this is where it gets a little more interesting and possibly a little bit more controversial. So the GPU is RDNA 3 based, not RDNA 4, and it has 28 CUs at up to 2.45 gigahertz sustained clocks. So if we look in the AMD parts bin as to what that likely is, it's probably Navi 33, which is the same die that's an RX 7600. That chip, though, has 32 CUs. So this would be cut down slightly from that 32 CU allocation to 28 CUs. Valve says it's semi-custom. I assume the semi-custom means off-the-shelf part, new configuration, right? That's usually what that means. So in this context, it's not actually a very new part, I would think. It has only 8 gigabytes of GDDR6 memory. And if you think about the memory configuration there, it's probably a 128-bit bus, which would be no surprise because that's the maximum memory bus configuration in the Navi 33 product. I did submit some more detailed questions about the memory bus and things like that, but I did not get a response back in time for the recording or publication of this video. So this is a bit tricky on the GPU side. And I really want to hear what Alex thinks about this. And obviously Rich, but the GPU here is not that crazy. The RX 7600 is in the mix with cards like the RTX 4060 in rasterization and considerably behind that in ray tracing, and this is obviously weaker than that. And they're saying this is a 4K 60 box with FSR. Now, that's really going to depend on the game, is my feeling on that. We can talk about that a bit, but like I did play Cyberpunk on it in a few scenarios, and they were saying it would run at 4K 60, maybe 50 to 60 FPS, some variability there. And I was able to get it running at 1440p 60 with upscaling fairly easily. And I turned on the ray traced sun shadows and RT reflections, and it was dropping to something like the 30 FPS range. It was a little bit jittery though, because the TV they were demoing it on did not support VRR, which I thought was an interesting choice. So that was a little bit unpleasant. It's definitely going to be 4K 60 for some games with FSR, but like saying that as a blanket statement, I don't think that's going to be true. If we look at the current gen consoles, oftentimes they're 1440p 60 boxes, right? Or 4K 30 boxes with similar kinds of upscaling. They said the GPU pulls about 110 to 130 watts. In the spec sheet, it says 110, but they quoted up to 130 to me. And the overall system should have a power draw of about 200 watts under load, according to an engineer that I spoke to. But I mean, the more critical aspect, and again, I'd be interested to hear your feedback on this, is the 8 gigabytes of VRAM, because maybe that's not enough for modern games in a world where console titles can use like 10 gigabytes of VRAM fairly easily. I did ask a Valve engineer about this, and he said that 8 gigabytes is sufficient from their testing for their purposes for most games. And they wanted to emphasize affordability for the box itself. So yeah, I think there are two issues here. Number one, the GPU is like a little bit anemic, perhaps, or especially relative to current gen console spec, which it's trailing slightly, I would say. And then the 8 gigabytes of VRAM poses more possibly fundamental limits depending on the game, like we've seen in games like Indiana Jones.
Yeah. So I fully concur with what Oliver says is when you look at the spec sheet, I see a Zen 4 CPU, even with less cache. We've seen Zen 4 do quite well, especially when clocked up like this potentially can be. And I feel like that's actually one of the best parts of this device. You're getting a CPU that will last for a good amount of time and will be very capable. But then you get to the GPU, and there's nothing wrong with the device having a lower powered and less bandwidth GPU at all if you keep it within like constrained resolution and constrained settings. But then it kind of conflicts slightly with the nature of the box itself being described as 4K 60 capable, and also occupying the space in the living room with a no-fuss console-like experience. And I don't want to say this is 100% the exact same thing as a console, and I don't think Valve would say that either, because they are leveraging PC technology. They are leveraging the fact that you load up PC games with like settings in them. But at the same time, as you throw in a GPU of that, I would say performance level, and then tack on 8 gigs of VRAM into it, what it necessitates from many users, and that's why I make videos at all, is that you have to then go into the option settings and start changing things. And as soon as you start doing that, it becomes a less straightforward device and a less straightforward experience. And I think that is the largest conflict for me. And the big contenders really are going to be modern AAA games that were designed around the consoles, which have access to more video memory in general than what this device has. And the things that can do to the player experience are generally very negative. Turning down something like lighting to medium quality is not that big of a deal usually, but turning down texture quality and or overgoing texture budget with VRAM means either a very, very blurry texture experience at times, or a very stuttery experience, or a performance, cliff experience where all of a sudden you get to some point in the game and it runs at 10 FPS for like 15 seconds until it purges things that were in VRAM that shouldn't have been there. And right. Those are things that I would want to avoid as much as possible if I were designing a box, trying to be as user-friendly as possible. But I think that's what the interview that Oliver had with that one engineer described, that this is an affordability concern, which is something we've both heard from AMD and NVIDIA in the past. It's kind of how they've kind of justified the whole, that's why we put out an 8 gigabyte GPU. They've also justified it with gamers are playing at 1080p, something that I don't find nearly as plausible as a reason for it. Because you can still have VRAM limitation issues at 1080p. So I feel like that is the lowest and the most questionable part of this spec that I would be curious to see running in the wild, because they only showed you a certain set of games, Oliver. I would personally like to see myself, okay, what happens when I load up Monster Hunter on it? Like, does this run terribly? Can it even run Monster Hunter? That's using, direct storage and stuff like that. There's a lot of questions that I just don't have really great answers to right now, but I can imagine it right now in my setup, like right there, right where the Series X is. I just take that off, and I could use that as a foil to my PC gaming reviews, where I say like, oh, let's see how the Steam machine runs this. I could actually imagine myself doing that, because I kind of want to do that, because I like the fact that Valve is putting out a Linux desktop PC-like experience that's more curated, because I'm kind of fed up with Windows. So I think this is a very appealing device, even if it has hardware spec things that I'm a little bit concerned about right now.
From my perspective, from a sort of conceptual angle, this is kind of like almost a preview of what Microsoft is going to be attempting to be doing with whatever its next generation thing is, which is essentially it's built on a PC operating system, but it is heavily games focused with a games orientated UI that you boot into, which I think is pretty great, which is proven to work on Steam Deck. And in this sense, Valve are way, way, way ahead of anything we've seen from Microsoft. So I really like the concept of having this PC, which is games focused, games first, and looks fantastic and looks console-like. I think this is a really, really cool looking device. Really interested in your impressions on the form factor in a bit, Oliver. But let's talk about the specifications, because it is fundamentally a PC, right? And I guess, there are two options here for the SKUs. You've got a 512 gigabyte SKU, which I'll tell you what, I've got a 512 gigabyte SSD in my ROG Ally, and I just run out of space all the time. It's really difficult to actually keep a good number of games on that. I think automatically you're going to be wanting the 2 terabyte SSD version. Yeah. And the other thing about having this concept of SKUs is that I do really wish that there was an 8 and 16 gigabyte VRAM version.
Yes, yeah, really.
Because, the RX 7600 comes in 8 gigabyte and 16 gigabyte variations. So, fundamentally it is possible. I think they could have done that. Obviously, it depends on what the makeup of the motherboard looks like for this specific device. But I don't suppose you saw the motherboard, did you, Oliver?
I did not. I saw it semi-naked, semi-disassembled, but not completely.
Okay.
Yeah.
CPU... don't have any problems at all with that, to be honest. It's going to be absolutely fine, I'd imagine. I mean, obviously, games where we've seen fundamental, foundational problems with CPU utilization, it's going to be better than the Ryzen 5 3600, which you often show in your videos, Alex, but obviously nowhere near the 9800X3D, which you also show in your videos. But ultimately, I think it's fine for a device where I think they're addressing a specific price point. Now, the GPU, I've been trying to sort of get in my head what we should be expecting from this, because it is fundamentally a cut down version of the RX 7600 desktop card, which, I think it was like $270 when it launched. It's okay. It's fine. Not fantastic. There are some cutbacks here. The TDP has been reduced. The CU count, obviously, 28 versus 32. So, yeah, I mean, there aren't any 28 CU RDNA 3 consumer gaming parts to actually compare to. If you go back to the RX 6600 RDNA 2, that is 28 CUs, and it's significantly slower than the 7600. I've got some benchmarks here. I don't want it to be taken as this is what the frame rates of the Steam machine are going to be. That's not the case. It's basically relative performance under identical workloads between this range of GPUs, right? And I kind of suspect that we're going to be looking at some midpoint between the RX 6600 and the RX 7600 based on those benchmarks there.
Right.
And I've also included RTX 3060 and 4060 so you can get an idea of where it sits in NVIDIA land. I think that's okay. I think, the concept of it running 4K 60, I think it was, let's be clear, I think they were saying it's 4K 60 with FSR. That was... with upscaling, which is, that can be as wide as you like. It could be like native 720p up to 4K with ultra performance mode, which you wouldn't want to do. I think 1080p is with upscaling on challenging titles is going to be probably what this machine is best suited for, and optimized settings. Obviously, these benchmarks, I mean, the nature of PC benchmarking is typically you ramp everything up to ultra, and as we've seen, especially with Unreal Engine 5, that is a fool's errand. You should not be doing that. I think it's all going to come down to price, because, if this is a $399 box, that very, very much excites me. If we're talking about comparisons to consoles and they're rolling up with a $499 price point, I find that problematic. And who knows what's going to be happening with those two storage SKUs in terms of pricing as well. $500 kind of takes you into PlayStation 5 territory. Obviously, they're different machines fundamentally in terms of one has a foundational PC basis, but this is a console play as well. And I'd say in terms of where you're going to sit this device, it's at some midpoint between Xbox Series S and PlayStation 5, probably closer to the PlayStation 5 side of things. But certainly the PS5 probably will have better performance overall.
Yeah.
Just need to wait and see. I guess this will be using Steam. Well, it is using SteamOS, therefore it's using the RAD-V driver. So there's going to be some interesting comparison points to running this on Windows, because in some aspects, RAD-V can be much faster than Windows, believe it or not. So yeah, there's a bit of a grey area in terms of performance, but I personally wouldn't have been saying this is a 4K machine even with upscaling. I think you've got to be on a much higher performance tier at this point with today's AAA games for sure. There's actually something you got to say about saying any piece of hardware is specifically tied to a specific resolution target, because the nature of games is such that the scalability within them, and of course their baseline performance requirement, radically changes from game to game, which basically means that more challenging titles will need a higher performing GPU to get to that resolution target. So yeah, I don't think you should have been saying this is a 4K machine, because that is a claim that has backfired spectacularly for going back to Xbox One X, which this is a 4K machine, and it's like, well, yeah, and no. So yeah, interesting stuff there. 16 gigs of SODIMM memory, that's fine, right? I mean, 24 gigs in total. I mean, that is going to be, I suspect, quite expensive for them to produce, especially in the current climate of escalating memory prices. I think this spec is fine. I do wish there was a 16 gig memory alternative there. And 8 gigs, well, everything will run, right? It's just a question of how well it will run and how bad some of those textures are going to look. I mean, I'm just thinking of Stellar Blade in particular. That was the last game I looked at where, it needed to be run at medium settings, and the difference between medium settings and highs, and indeed PlayStation 5 was huge. It does have a fundamental impact on the game. That said, I can fully understand the price sensitivity nature of it. And that's exactly the same rationale that both AMD and NVIDIA have come up with for, the 5060 class cards out there at the moment. And the 9060, of course, that's also available in an 8 gig configuration.